A 32-year-old engineer and his assistant were checking a meter in a landfill manhole. It was only 7 feet deep, and the meter was about 2 feet down. The engineer reached down to remove the meter, but lost his grip and it dropped to the bottom. In the few seconds it took for him to climb down and pick up the meter, he was overcome by toxic methane vapors and collapsed. He was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. A 29-year-old welder was performing routine repairs on a fuel tanker. Tragically, he failed to make sure that all residual fuel vapors had been properly removed when he started welding inside the tank. The tank exploded, killing him instantly. A sanitation worker, 49 years old, died while rescuing a co-worker who had been overcome with hydrogen sulfide gas in an underground sewer vault. The first worker went in first and was overcome. The second worker saw him pass out and immediately went in after him. After getting his partner out, the second worker was then overcome himself, and before rescue personnel could get him out, he died. A 38-year-old farmer was working alone, unloading corn from a large bin. When the flow of corn stopped, he climbed to the hatch on the roof and discovered that a frozen crust had developed on the surface of the grain. Foolishly, he entered the bin to break apart the crusted grain. But the crusted layer collapsed, and he was immediately engulfed. All of these confined spaces you've just seen, they seemed safe enough at first glance, right? Well, the grim reality is that every year, nearly 100 people die in the United States in seemingly ordinary spaces just like these. Now, you may think, what's so dangerous about a confined space? Well, that's what we're about to find out. In fact, we're going to learn a whole lot about confined spaces and the proper way to enter them. In this program, we're going to go over the following 5 topics regarding confined space entry. First, we're going to discuss identifying confined spaces. Second, we'll go over the hazards that are found in confined spaces. Third, we'll talk about understanding confined space entry permits, what they are, who's in charge of them, and how they work. Fourth, we'll discuss understanding hazard controls, or ways to manage or control the hazards related to confined spaces. And lastly, we'll talk about the importance of having an entire entry team and following a proper entry protocol whenever the need arises to enter any confined space. And this includes knowing the important role you play on the confined space entry team. So, what is a confined space? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration defines it as any space that is large enough for a person to enter and perform work in. 2. Has a limited opening for entry and exit. And 3. Isn't intended for continuous human occupancy. This encompasses a whole host of spaces, such as manholes, silos, tanks, boilers, sewers, vats, ventilation ducts, pipelines, and many others. Here's the important thing. OSHA tells us that confined spaces exist in virtually every industry, and many workers come into contact with one during the course of their work, sometimes without even realizing it. Now, one more thing about identifying confined spaces, and that's this. Some confined spaces are more hazardous than others and require an OSHA-required entry permit before anybody enters the space. Permit-required confined spaces are spaces that meet the first 3 criteria, but may have any one of these 4 additional criteria as well. 1. Spaces that might contain a hazardous breathing atmosphere, like too little oxygen, or oxygen deficient, containing less than 19.5% oxygen by volume, or too much oxygen, known as an oxygen-enriched atmosphere, which contains more than 23.5% oxygen by volume, or toxic vapors. 2. Spaces that contain material that has the potential to engulf someone inside, like grain silos or water tanks. 3. Spaces that have walls that converge inward, or floors that slope downward and taper into a smaller area, which could trap or asphyxiate someone inside. And 4. Spaces that contain any other safety or health hazard, such as unguarded machinery, exposed live wires, or heat stress. Basically, any space that contains serious hazards, anything that can cause death or serious injury, must be classified as a permit-required space. What is it about confined spaces that could hurt or even kill you? 65% of fatalities in confined spaces have to do with a hazardous atmosphere inside the space. Let's say you enter a confined space, but there isn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere to sustain you. Within minutes, your heart rate's going to go up. You'll start to feel weak. Your judgment will be impaired. You'll begin to lose motor skills. You may experience nausea and vomiting. And finally, you'll pass out. And if you don't get oxygen right away, you'll die. It can happen that fast. A space's oxygen level can decrease when it's burned up due to welding or grinding, when rusting or fermentation occurs, or when other gases like carbon dioxide or nitrogen displace it. And one last thing about low oxygen levels. Even the area just outside a confined space can be oxygen deficient. So, don't even break the plane of the opening without following proper confined space entry protocol. Just as too little oxygen is a huge hazard, so is too much oxygen. When too much oxygen gets in the atmosphere, it can cause combustible materials to ignite very quickly. When a source of ignition, such as a sparking tool or a grinder, is introduced to a space with a combustible atmosphere, a fire or explosion is inevitable. Another atmospheric hazard is toxic gas, which is often odorless, but has the potential to injure or even kill. Nitrogen, hydrogen fluoride, and cadmium vapor are a few examples that can be deadly if the maximum amount or concentration is greater than the listed permissible exposure level, or PEL. With most toxic gases, there is little or no warning before a person is overcome. Some confined spaces, such as grain silos, food and water storage tanks, and other holding bins, carry the risk of engulfment. Engulfment is always a danger when there are small particles or liquid in the space that could bury you or drown you. Falls are always a risk in a confined space. A fall from a ladder, such as this one, could be catastrophic. Electrical components and wiring or machinery with exposed moving parts certainly pose a safety risk. Machinery could start up unexpectedly, or exposed wiring could create a fire or shock hazard. Flammable gases can lead to devastating explosions. Other dangers include heat, cold, noise, vibration, and fatigue, all of which can lead to incidents and injuries. It's important that you fully understand the potential risks involved with entering any confined space. You must know how to identify hazards and respond appropriately. After all, the results of hazards such as these can include serious damage to your health, injury, and even death. What is a confined space entry permit? Basically, it's an OSHA-required document that serves as a game plan, if you will, for any entry and work to be done in a confined space. The permit is a mandatory part of any confined space program, which must be in place whenever entering hazardous confined spaces is a possibility. The program creates and defines the need for the confined space permit. The confined space entry permit is executed by a properly trained entry supervisor or safety representative, and it ensures that every confined space entry operation is thoroughly planned out before even beginning, and that every safety precaution is taken once the operation is underway. This little piece of paper might not seem like much at first glance, but it's the heart and soul of any entry operation. Consider all the functions this one document performs. It details the purpose of the entry and the scope of work to be performed inside. It details the date, time, and duration of the entry. It lists all the members of the entry team. It lists the hazards that are present and details the plan to control them. It lists all PPE, ventilation, and work equipment that will be required. It lists the results of the initial atmospheric test of the confined space. It notes rescue services to be summoned if needed and lists the means, such as equipment to use and phone numbers to call for summoning those rescue services. Once the purpose of entry and scope of work have been identified, the entry supervisor tests the site for atmospheric hazards and performs a precursory inspection to see if any other potential safety risks exist. He notes these on the permit. Next, the entry supervisor develops an entry plan with the entry team. Everyone clearly understands the hazards and safeguards, the job at hand, and the role each person will play. Finally, the signed entry permit is clearly posted at the entrance of the confined space. Now, let's talk about how to manage and control hazards. First, warning signs and barrier protection, like the ones seen here, are placed around the confined space entrance to protect those on the outside and those on the inside. The second control measure is atmospheric testing. The proper testing of the atmosphere inside a confined space using appropriately calibrated monitors and detectors determines whether respirators or self-contained breathing apparatuses will be needed, or if a typical ventilation protocol will suffice. Either way, before anyone enters the space, the atmosphere inside is tested for oxygen levels, flammable gases, and toxic vapors, and must be tested specifically in that order. What's more, the site must continue to be tested at regular intervals for as long as the space is occupied. Carbon monoxide and other toxic gases must be removed from the space and air from a clean source introduced. This can be accomplished via general dilution methods or by exhaust systems. Measures need to be taken to ensure against falls. Anyone entering a confined space must use a body harness with a retrieval line, unless the lifeline creates a greater hazard due to the mechanical configuration inside the space. This is to protect against injurious falls and also to allow attendants on the outside to perform a non-entry rescue should one become necessary. Here, you can see an entrant has passed out due to toxic vapors. Even though he's unconscious, the attendants above are able to quickly remove him from the space without entering the space themselves and becoming exposed to the same toxic vapors. They do this by way of a davit arm or tripod set up at the entrance with the lifeline attached to the worker's harness. Remember, any vertical entry of 5 feet or more requires a mechanical hoisting device connected to a davit or a tripod be present and working properly. Material flow into the space must be prevented so there is no way for a worker in the confined space to be trapped or engulfed while inside. This can be done by locking and tagging the isolating devices and disconnecting the piping by blanking, blinding, or double block and bleed methods. Additionally, if electrical or mechanical dangers exist, circuits should be similarly turned off, locked out, and tagged out. As in any situation that involves safety risks, personal protective equipment is central. These may include such things as respirators or self-contained breathing apparatuses, a body harness with an attached lifeline, safety shoes, safety gloves, safety glasses, hard hats, all depending on the work to be conducted and the circumstances of the confined space. There must be a continual line of communication between the people going into the confined space and the attendants on the outside. This might be accomplished using verbal checks, but might also include hand signals, rope tugs, or other pre-planned methods of communication during the operation. Any entry into a confined space carries with it the potential for injury and even death, so it should never be undertaken without thorough planning and team coordination. The men and women you see here They form what we call the Confined Space Entry Team. They're fully prepared and equipped for a safe and productive operation. There are 4 basic groups of players on the entry team: entrants, attendants, entry supervisors, and rescue services. First are the entrants. These are the guys and gals that actually go into the confined space to perform the tasks at hand. They're the front line. Their health and safety is the primary concern of everyone on the team. It's the entrant's responsibility to recognize any warning sign or symptom of exposure to a dangerous situation or prohibited condition. All entrants must quickly exit the confined space when an order to evacuate is given by an attendant or the entry supervisor, when an alarm is sounded, or when the entrant recognizes a warning sign of exposure to a dangerous situation or prohibited condition. Next in the lineup are the attendants. These are the folks that remain outside the permit space during entry operations. They communicate with the entrants to monitor their status and alert entrants of the need to evacuate the space. They are also responsible for assisting the entrant in exiting the confined space, and if an emergency arises, they're the ones who will summon rescue and other emergency services. Perhaps most importantly, it is the job of the attendant to perform a non-entry rescue in accordance with the pre-planned rescue procedure if such a need arises. If you're an entrant, you don't ever want to go into a confined space without a qualified attendant watching your back. Thirdly, the entry supervisor. This is a highly qualified person who is responsible for the entire entry operation. The entry supervisor prepares the entry permit and makes sure it is followed with precision. Though not necessarily on site for the entire operation, he or she supervises all aspects of the entry, from the early planning stages through to completion and exit of the confined space. Last of all come the rescue services workers. These highly trained team members may be on-site or off-site professionals, like the local fire department, who are prepared, equipped, and ready in the event of any emergency that may occur during the entry operation. Now that we know who the team is, what they do, and what the potential hazards are, let's talk for a minute about the role of each team member in a rescue scenario. It all starts with the rescue plan. Good planning and preparation can greatly reduce the time needed to rescue a fellow worker in crisis. Everyone should know exactly what he or she will do in the event of an emergency. If at any time there is any questionable action or non-movement by the entrant inside, a verbal check should be made by the attendant. If the entrant gives no response, the rescue plan should be put into action immediately. Body safety harnesses with attached lifelines must be used by all entrants. As mentioned earlier, an exception would be if the lifeline creates a greater hazard due to the mechanical configuration inside the space. Attendants should attempt to remove a disabled entrant via his lifeline before entering the space. This is the preferred method of rescue, even for horizontal entries. If non-entry rescue with a lifeline fails or is not an option, an attendant immediately radios or signals for help from rescue services. The attendant should never enter the confined space and leave the area only after being relieved outside by another attendant. SCBA equipment or self-contained breathing apparatus kept at the entry should be used only to ensure that the attendant may safely remain at the entrance in the event of atmospheric contamination. Keep in mind that most errors, especially fatal errors, happen when emergency rescues are being undertaken. People panic and forget or forego proper protocol. Not convinced? Then consider this alarming statistic. 2/3 of confined space deaths happen to people who are trying to rescue someone else. It can't be stressed enough how important it is to approach any confined space entry with great caution and planning. The dangers that lie in wait inside a confined space are usually invisible and often completely unexpected. So, let's recap. We've gone over the definition of a confined space and the potential hazards associated with them. We've reviewed the entry permit process and methods to manage and control hazards. We've also discussed the entry team and rescue procedures. So, before you enter any confined space, be sure you thoroughly go over the pre-entry checklist. 1. The entry permit is completed and signed. 2. Barriers are erected outside the space. 3. Warning signs are in place. 4. Input lines are capped or blanked. 5. Lockout, tagout of equipment is in place. 6. Space is ventilated as specified on the permit. 7. All approved PPE is on site. 8. Everyone understands the emergency action plan. Remember, in a matter of mere seconds, your life could be radically altered forever or even ended when working in confined spaces. Training in this area should be an ongoing process, not just a once-and-done kind of thing. You will receive periodic training determined by the level of risk involved with what you're doing and/or your supervisor's assessment. Please always follow the protocol. Remember what you've learned in this training program and keep yourself and your coworkers safe.